This is Margaret. Look at her face. She's 78 years old now, but what I'm about to tell you happened when she was just 18. Her own father, the man who brought her into this world, did something so evil, so unthinkable, that when I first heard this story, I couldn't sleep for days. What you're going to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about family, about love, about justice, because Margaret's father didn't just betray her. He tried to murder her in the most cruel way imaginable. But here's what makes this story absolutely incredible. Margaret didn't just survive. She planned the most devastating, most satisfying revenge that completely destroyed her father's life and legacy. And when I tell you how she did it, you're going to lose your mind. I need to warn you, this story contains some of the darkest moments you'll ever hear. There were times when I had to stop recording because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. But stick with me, because the ending will make you stand up and cheer. You see, Margaret's father thought he was getting rid of a problem. He thought he was burying his shame, but what he actually did was create his worst nightmare. He created an enemy who would spend decades plotting his destruction, and she succeeded beyond your wildest imagination. This all started in 1962 in a small town in Ohio. Margaret was 18 years old, living with her father Robert and her stepmother Helen. To everyone in town, Robert Thompson looked like the perfect man. He owned the biggest construction company. He employed half the town. He went to church every Sunday. Everyone respected him. They had no idea what kind of monster lived behind that smile. Margaret had always been the perfect daughter. She cooked every meal, cleaned the entire house, took care of her younger half, siblings, and never complained. But nothing she did was ever good enough for Robert and Helen. Every day was criticism, insults, and humiliation, but Margaret had a secret. She was saving money from her part-time job at the local diner. Every penny went into a hidden jar under her floorboard. She was going to leave on her 19th birthday and never look back. She had it all planned out. 3 weeks before her birthday, everything changed. Margaret came home from work to find her father and stepmother sitting at the kitchen table with serious expressions. Her heart started pounding because she knew something was wrong. "Sit down, Margaret," Robert said coldly. "We've made a decision about your future," Helen said with this cruel smile that Margaret had learned to fear. Then Robert said the words that would change Margaret's life forever. "You're going to marry Thomas Mitchell." Margaret felt the world spinning around her. Thomas Mitchell was a 45-year-old man who owned the local hardware store. He was Robert's business partner. He was also known around town for his violent temper and the mysterious way his first wife had fallen down the stairs and died. "I won't do it," Margaret whispered. Robert's face turned red with rage. "You will do as I say. I've already taken the dowry money. The wedding is next month." "What dowry money?" Margaret asked, but deep down she already knew. Helen laughed cruelly. "Your college fund, dear. Your father found that little jar of yours. Turns out you had quite a lot saved up." Thomas was very impressed. Margaret's world collapsed. 3 years of saving, 3 years of dreaming, gone. But then Robert said something that changed everything. "You should be grateful, Margaret. Thomas is willing to take damaged goods like you." Damaged goods. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "Don't act innocent. We know about you and that Mexican boy from the diner." This was a complete lie. Margaret had never been with any boy, but Robert was planning to spread these rumors to force her into the marriage. In 1962, in their small conservative town, a woman's reputation was everything. "You have 1 week to get used to the idea," Robert said, standing up, "or you can get out of my house right now with nothing but the clothes on your back." That night, Margaret made the bravest decision of her life. She was going to run away. At 2 a.m., she crept out of the house with a small bag of clothes. She walked 12 miles in the freezing November night to the bus station in the next town. She had sold her mother's wedding ring, the only valuable thing she owned, to buy a ticket to Chicago. She was going to disappear and start a new life. But as she sat in that empty bus station at 6 a.m., waiting for her bus, she heard a car pulling up outside. Her heart sank. Through the window, she saw her father's black pickup truck. Robert walked into that bus station with two of his construction workers, big, intimidating men who did whatever Robert told them to do. "Time to come home, Margaret," Robert said quietly, but his eyes were filled with a rage she had never seen before. "I bought a ticket," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm 18. I can leave if I want to." Robert laughed and pulled out a piece of paper. It was a legal document declaring Margaret mentally unfit and making Robert her legal guardian. In 1962, it was easy for a man to have his daughter declared mentally incompetent. All he needed was one doctor's signature and a judge's approval. Robert had both. "You're coming home, and you're going to marry Thomas Mitchell," Robert said. "And if you ever try to run away again, there are institutions for girls like you. Very unpleasant institutions." Those two construction workers grabbed Margaret and dragged her to the truck. Nobody in that bus station tried to help her. Nobody even looked. 3 weeks later, the wedding took place in Robert's backyard. Margaret wore her mother's old dress, but there was no joy in her eyes, only defeat. Thomas Mitchell was drunk before the ceremony even started. During their first dance, he whispered in Margaret's ear, "You belong to me now, girl, and I'm going to make sure you never forget it." For 2 years, Margaret lived in hell. Thomas was violent, controlling, and cruel. He locked her in the house during the day and watched her every move. He took away her job and forbade her from speaking to any of her old friends. Margaret tried to reach out to her father for help, but Robert would just laugh. "You made your bed, Margaret. Now lie in it." In 1964, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. For the first time in 2 years, she felt hope. Maybe having a child would change Thomas. But when she told Thomas the news, his reaction was horrifying. "How do I know it's even mine?" he snarled. "You've probably been sneaking around behind my back." Margaret was devastated. "Thomas, the baby is yours. I swear." Thomas hit her so hard she fell to the floor. "Don't you dare lie to me." That night, Thomas threw Margaret out of the house with nothing but the clothes on her back. She was 3 months pregnant, had no money, and nowhere to go. She walked through the freezing December night back to her father's house. Surely Robert wouldn't turn away his pregnant daughter. She was so wrong. When Margaret knocked on her father's door, Robert opened it with an expression of pure disgust. "What are you doing here?" "Thomas threw me out," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm pregnant, and I have nowhere else to go." Robert looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something that would haunt Margaret forever. He laughed. "So Thomas finally figured out what kind of woman you really are," Robert said. "I told him you were trouble. Daddy, please, I need help. I'm carrying your grandchild. My grandchild." Robert's voice was filled with venom. "Who knows whose bastard that is? You've been nothing but a burden since the day you were born." Helen appeared behind Robert with that same cruel smile. "We can't have the whole town knowing that Robert Thompson's daughter is pregnant and abandoned," Helen said. "Think of what that would do to his reputation." Robert nodded. "You're right, we need to handle this quietly." Margaret felt hope rising in her chest. Maybe they were going to help her after all. She was about to learn just how wrong she could be. "There's an old fence post about 5 miles out of town," Robert said. "Near the abandoned Miller farm. People hardly ever go out there, especially in winter." Margaret didn't understand. "What do you mean?" Robert's eyes went dead cold. "Get in the truck, Margaret. We're going for a ride." Margaret got into that truck, thinking her father was taking her somewhere safe. Maybe to a home for unwed mothers. Maybe to relatives in another town. Instead, Robert drove her to the most isolated spot in the county. 5 miles from the nearest house, surrounded by frozen fields and bare trees. "Get out," Robert ordered. Margaret stepped out, confused and terrified. The wind was howling and snow was starting to fall. "Daddy, what are we doing here?" Robert walked to the back of his truck and pulled out a length of rope. Margaret's blood turned to ice. "Daddy, what's that for?" "You've been nothing but a problem since the day you were born," Robert said, his voice completely emotionless. "Your mother died giving birth to you. You've brought shame to our family, and now you're pregnant with some bastard child that nobody wants." He started walking toward her with the rope. "I'm done dealing with your problems, Margaret. The whole town will think you ran away. In a few years, everyone will forget you ever existed." Margaret tried to run, but she was 3 months pregnant and weak from months of abuse. Robert caught her easily. "Please, Daddy, please don't do this. I'm your daughter. You stopped being my daughter the day you became a burden," Robert said as he tied her hands behind her back. Then he tied her to that fence post. In the middle of nowhere, in December, with snow starting to fall and the temperature dropping below freezing. "Someone will find you eventually," Robert said as he walked back to his truck. "Maybe in spring when the snow melts. By then, nature will have taken care of my problem." Margaret screamed and begged as Robert drove away, leaving her tied to that fence post to die. For 3 days and 2 nights, Margaret was tied to that fence post. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees below zero. Snow piled up around her. She couldn't feel her hands and feet. She was sure she was going to die. On the 3rd day, she stopped feeling cold. She knew that meant her body was shutting down. She said goodbye to her unborn child and prepared to die. That's when she heard the sound of an engine. Through the swirling snow, she saw an old pickup truck approaching. A man got out and ran toward her. "Oh my God," he whispered as he saw Margaret tied to the fence post. "What happened to you?" His name was Samuel Martinez. He was a ranch hand who worked on a farm 10 miles away. He had been driving to town when he decided to take a shortcut through the back roads. Samuel untied Margaret and carried her to his truck. She was unconscious and barely breathing. He drove her straight to the county hospital, saving her life and the life of her unborn child. When Margaret woke up 3 days later, the first person she saw was her father. Robert was sitting next to her bed, holding her hand and looking like a concerned parent. "Thank God you're awake, sweetheart," he said loud enough for the nurses to hear. "We were so worried when you went missing." Margaret tried to speak, but her throat was damaged from screaming in the cold. "The doctors say you have frostbite and hypothermia," Robert continued. "You must have gotten lost in the storm." Margaret shook her head frantically, but Robert leaned in close and whispered in her ear, "If you tell anyone what really happened, I'll make sure you end up in the state mental hospital, and your baby will disappear. Do you understand me?" Margaret understood. Robert Thompson was the most powerful man in their small town. If he said his daughter was mentally ill, people would believe him, so Margaret stayed quiet. She let everyone believe she had gotten lost in a snowstorm. After 2 weeks in the hospital, Robert took Margaret home, but instead of taking her upstairs to her old room, he led her down to the basement. "You'll stay down here until that baby is born," Robert told her. "Then we'll figure out what to do with both of you." Margaret spent the next 6 months locked in that basement. Robert brought her food once a day. Helen would come down occasionally just to remind Margaret how much trouble she was causing. "Your father should have left you on that fence post," Helen would say, "would have saved us all a lot of problems." In June 1965, Margaret went into labor. Robert refused to take her to the hospital. "Too many questions," he said. Helen delivered the baby in that cold, dark basement. It was a little girl, healthy and beautiful despite everything Margaret had been through. Margaret held her daughter for exactly 10 minutes. Then Robert took the baby away. "Where are you taking her?" Margaret screamed. "Don't worry about it," Robert said. "She's going to a good family, better than anything you could give her." Margaret never saw her daughter again. Robert told the town that Margaret had left to live with relatives in California. He said she was too ashamed about her failed marriage to stay. People accepted this story. But Margaret didn't go to California. She stayed locked in that basement for another year while Robert figured out what to do with her. In September 1966, Helen had a heart attack and died suddenly. Robert was devastated and started drinking heavily. More importantly, he got careless about keeping Margaret locked up. One night, when Robert had passed out drunk upstairs, Margaret managed to pick the lock on her basement prison using a hairpin. It had taken her months to figure out how to do it. She crept upstairs and found Robert's wallet. Inside was $300. She also found something that made her blood run cold, a birth certificate for her daughter. The baby's name was listed as Susan Thompson, and Robert was listed as the father. There was no mention of Margaret anywhere. Robert had sold her baby and told the buyers that he was the father and the child was an orphan. Margaret took the money and the birth certificate and ran. This time, she made it out of town. Margaret took a bus to Chicago and started a completely new life. She got a job as a waitress and rented a tiny apartment. She changed her last name to Martinez, honoring the man who had saved her life. For the next 10 years, Margaret focused on two things: survival and planning her revenge. She worked multiple jobs and saved every penny. She taught herself to read legal documents at the public library. She learned about property law, business law, and inheritance law. Most importantly, she hired a private investigator to find her daughter. In 1976, the investigator found Susan. She was 11 years old, adopted by a wealthy family in Detroit. They believed she was an orphan whose parents had died in a car accident. Susan was happy and healthy. Margaret made a difficult decision. She wouldn't disrupt Susan's life, but she would make sure Susan got what was rightfully hers someday. By 1976, Margaret had saved $50,000. She had also discovered something shocking about her father's business. Robert Thompson Construction was built on lies, fraud, and stolen money. Margaret spent 2 years investigating her father. What she found was devastating. Robert had been cheating his workers out of their pensions for over 20 years. He had been billing customers for materials he never used. He had been avoiding taxes by hiding money in fake accounts. Most importantly, he had built his entire empire using money that should have belonged to Margaret. When Margaret's mother died in 1944, she had left behind a substantial inheritance, $25,000, which would be worth over $300,000 today. That money was supposed to be held in trust for Margaret until she turned 21, but Robert had stolen it and used Margaret's inheritance to start his construction company. Margaret now had a choice. She could turn this information over to the authorities, or she could take personal revenge. She chose revenge. Margaret's plan was brilliant and devastating. First, she used her savings to hire the best lawyers in Chicago. Then, in 1978, she did something that took incredible courage. She went back home. 40-year-old Margaret returned to the small town where her nightmare had begun. She had been gone for 12 years, and most people didn't recognize the confident, well-dressed woman she had become. She rented a house across the street from Robert's mansion and started watching, planning, waiting. Robert was now 68 years old and in poor health. His drinking had gotten worse, and his business was starting to decline. Margaret learned everything about his daily routine. She also learned something very interesting. Robert had been telling people for years that his daughter had died in California. He had even put up a fake grave marker in the town cemetery. On November 15, 1978, exactly 16 years after Robert had tied Margaret to that fence post, she walked into his office. Robert was sitting behind his desk when he looked up and saw Margaret standing in his doorway. His face went white as a sheet. "Hello, Daddy," Margaret said calmly. "Margaret, but you're supposed to be dead." "Dead? Is that what you told people, that your daughter died?" Margaret smiled coldly and sat down across from his desk. "I know about the pension fraud, Daddy. I know about the tax evasion. I know about all the corners you've cut and people you've cheated over the years. Robert's face was getting redder. You can't prove anything. Margaret opened her purse and pulled out a thick folder. Actually, I can prove everything. Bank records, witness statements, forged documents. I've been investigating you for 2 years, and I have enough evidence to put you in prison for the rest of your miserable life. She leaned forward. But I'm not here to send you to prison, Daddy. I'm here to make you an offer. Here's what's going to happen, Margaret said, her voice deadly calm. You're going to sign over your entire business to me. Every building, every contract, every asset, all of it. Robert laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're crazy if you think I'm going to do that. Oh, but you are, Margaret continued, because if you don't, I'm going to the FBI tomorrow morning. You'll be arrested for fraud, tax evasion, and theft. At your age and in your condition, a prison sentence would be a death sentence. She opened another folder. I also have evidence that you stole my inheritance to build this company. That $25,000 my mother left me, you used it to start Thompson Construction. This whole empire should have been mine from the beginning. Robert's hands were shaking now. And there's one more thing, Margaret continued. I know about Susan. I know you sold my daughter and told her adoptive parents she was an orphan. That's kidnapping, Daddy. That's fraud. That carries serious federal time. Margaret stood up. You have 24 hours to decide. Sign everything over to me or spend your final years in federal prison. The next day, Robert signed every document. Margaret now owned Thompson Construction, worth over $2 million. But Margaret wasn't done. She immediately fired every supervisor who had helped Robert cheat workers. She paid back all the stolen pensions with interest. She reported Robert's tax evasion to the IRS. Within 6 months, Robert was bankrupt and facing multiple criminal charges. But the cruelest blow came when Margaret did something brilliant. She legally changed the company name to Martinez Construction, honoring the man who saved her life instead of the monster who tried to kill her. Robert's name was erased from the business he spent 30 years building. In 1980, Margaret finally contacted Susan, now 15 years old. She didn't reveal the full truth that would be too traumatic. Instead, she told Susan she was a distant relative who had found her through genealogy research. Margaret didn't try to replace Susan's adoptive parents, who were wonderful people, but she did set up a college fund. And when Susan turned 18, Margaret gave her a letter explaining everything, along with legal documents proving Susan's right to half the Martinez Construction fortune. Susan was shocked but grateful. She kept her adoptive name but maintained a relationship with Margaret. Mother and daughter finally had the connection that Robert tried to destroy. Robert spent his final years in poverty and disgrace. The man who once owned half the town ended up in a tiny apartment, living on Social Security. He tried multiple times to contact Margaret, begging for forgiveness or financial help. Margaret's response was always the same: silence. In 1985, Robert died alone of liver failure. His funeral was attended by exactly 3 people. Margaret was not one of them, but she did visit his grave once to leave a single item. A photograph of herself tied to that fence post with a note. You should have left me there to die. It would have been kinder than what you created. Today, Margaret is 78 years old. Martinez Construction is worth over $50 million. The company is known for treating workers fairly and giving back to the community. Susan, now 53, runs the company alongside Margaret. She has children of her own who call Margaret Grandma Maggie. The basement where Margaret was imprisoned is now a community center for abused women. The fence post where she was left to die has been turned into a memorial for survivors of family violence, and Robert Thompson, his name appears nowhere in the town's history books. It's as if he never existed. Margaret erased him completely, just like he tried to do to her. Margaret didn't just survive her father's cruelty, she transformed it into something powerful. She took his weapons and used them against him. She took his empire and made it a force for good. She took his lies and replaced them with truth. In the end, she didn't just get revenge. She got justice. She got her daughter back. She got her life back. And she made sure that no one would ever hurt her again. Sometimes justice takes decades. Sometimes the best revenge is living well and building something beautiful. And sometimes the people who try to destroy us end up giving us the strength to become unstoppable. If Margaret's story teaches us anything, it's this: never underestimate the power of a woman who has nothing left to lose and everything to gain.